Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program here, as well as the European Studies program, and I'm delighted to feature The Strained Alliance, U.S.-European Relations from Nixon to Carter, co-edited by Matthias, Schulz, and Thomas Schwartz, today at this book launch, and very pleased to have Ambassador Dean join us on the panel, and of course thrilled to see all of you. Collected, edited volumes are sort of a tricky beast to sell, as every publisher will tell you. They're also tricky beasts to sell in terms of an event, a book event. But we have a fantastic panel here this afternoon for a session that is co-sponsored with the German Historical Institute. In fact, I should say largely sponsored with support from the Institute and its director, Almut Berghoff, and the editor, Dave Lazar, are present there. And our thanks to you for the collaboration and cooperation, and hopefully the first of many to come between the German Historical Institute and the Wilson Center. Let me briefly introduce our two editors, co-editors, and then a little while later on, Ambassador Dean. Who will speak first? Okay. We'll start with Professor Thomas Schwartz. He is professor of history at Vanderbilt University, where he specializes in the interaction between domestic politics, foreign policy, transnational coalitions, and alliance politics. He's working and teaches on the role of the American presidency in alliance leadership and the new international history of the Cold War. He, of course, has a distinguished biography, distinguished academic biography that most of you are familiar with, starting with his important book on McCloy and Germany, moving on to a major volume on Johnson in Europe, and working and bringing to a close, hopefully within the next year or so, biography of Henry Kissinger. And of course, he is co-editor of The Strained Alliances. He is a former Wilson Center Fellow and a former Wilson Center Public Policy Scholar, a longtime friend of the Center, of the Cold War Project, and its director. And so it's a pleasure to have him here, welcome him back to the Center. Matthias Schulz, his co-editor, who will speak after him, is professor of international relations at the University of Geneva, has been in this position since 2007. Prior to his position at Geneva, he has taught at the University of Mannheim, the University of Rostock, and Vanderbilt University, where he also led the Center for European Studies, and hence the connection with the conference that was organized and that the book is based on. He is the author of numerous journal articles like Tom, and he also has 3 monographs to his credit. And again, he is co-editor as well of The Strained Alliances, The Strained Alliance, and it's with great pleasure that I turn it over first to Tom, then to Matthias for about half an hour or so of highlights and findings from this volume, and then we'll give Ambassador Dean a chance to give a veteran's perspective, an expert's perspective on the events and the discussion. Tom.
We need to, microphones on?
They're on. Yes.
Okay. I want to initially start off with some acknowledgments. It's sort of, I feel really compelled to both thank the Wilson Center for allowing us to have this event, particularly Christian for sponsoring it here, the German Historical Institute as well for their sponsorship and of the conference that this book was originally based on, and for everything else related to it. Vanderbilt University, which also sponsored it, Cambridge University Press, and David Lazar, who's here, who was our incredible editor and did a wonderful job of bringing things together. As a co-editor of this volume, I also want to give special thanks to Matthias Schulz, who was my very valued colleague at Vanderbilt, where we shared in the training of Werner Lippert, who's one of the authors. We have one author here. We have one almost author, Bill Burr, who might want to say something about his almost article that should have gotten into this journal and should have on the Year of Europe. But we won't go there, Bill, I promise. I want to just say that without Matthias's persistence and encouragement, this book would never have seen the light of day. I can say that quite honestly, since I know what I'm often not capable of, and Matthias made sure that this happened. This book comes out of a conference that was held at Vanderbilt University in September of 2004. We were in the middle of a rather heated election contest at the time, as some of you might recall. Bringing over a group of European scholars at that time when their hotel was across the street from George Bush's Nashville headquarters, I think they all felt that they were in enemy territory in the notoriously red state of Tennessee. It very much provoked the introduction to this volume, namely I think many of the thoughts that Matthias and I had about putting together this volume came from a sense that the alliance in the early years of the aughts, or whatever we're going to call them, had some resemblance to the serious crises of the 1970s. The tensions and divisions of the 1970s were quite acute. Resemble doesn't mean identical, and in some respects the crises of this era, I think, took place in a much more difficult context than recent years. Time magazine has recently decided that the current decade should be titled The Decade from Hell, which is a demonstration, I think, that historical perspective is sorely lacking from the mainstream media. I'm working on, as Christian mentioned, a biography of Henry Kissinger, and so that has had me spending a lot of time in the 1970s, which were a very, very difficult decade. I want to read just a brief quotation from a document I found in the Canadian archives by a very perceptive diplomat, Marcel Cadeau, who was the ambassador of Canada to the United States. And he served from 1969 to 75. And Cadeau started off a memorandum on the United States that was dated June 1975. USA 1970 to 75, there is still hope. As it starts, during the 5.5 years of my posting in Washington, there has been a drastic change in the situation of the United States, both domestically and internationally. Most of it, but perhaps not all of it, for the worse. But there is still hope that, in the end, things may turn out for the best. The memo is not that uplifting. Let me read a section from a little later on. Again, when I came here 5 years ago, the power of the USA and its prestige in the world was still considerable. The President intended to withdraw from Vietnam, but he would do so with honor and without sacrificing essential objectives there or USA positions in the world. This has lamentably failed, and the United States has been humiliated. In the same period, they've had to adjust to acknowledge nuclear equality with the Soviet Union and to adjust to ever-increasing Soviet power and conventional armaments. This is bound to add here to the feeling of insecurity about the future and contribute to the general impression that the USA is weakening, that it is in a bad way. The southern flank is in serious disarray. The key remaining members of NATO have not been persuaded to undertake the military effort which would be needed to contain a Soviet thrust. He went on to say, when I came here, the United States was still clear-minded, strong, and confident. Now its strength and self-assurance have clearly diminished. The American view of themselves and of their role in the world has become blurred. I read that because I do think the 70s were a very, very difficult decade for the United States. And that translated, of course, into difficulties for the alliance as well. There were problems with the collapse of domestic legitimacy in the United States, the downgrading of institutions. There were also active terrorist movements, of course, in Western Europe. The economic strains of the time, unemployment and inflation contributing to stagflation, the oil shock of 1973-74, the misery index of unemployment and inflation. I think all of this is important to keep in mind in the context of going back and thinking about the 1970s and the era of this alliance politics during these years. Briefly, and this is as much a part of my current research as I think also comes clear in the volume, Nixon and Kissinger, especially Nixon, did want to model his presidency initially on the Eisenhower presidency. He thought very much in terms of Eisenhower as having demonstrated that quickly ending the war in Korea, becoming in effect the leader of the alliance, was part of Eisenhower's first term. And Nixon went to Europe very quickly. His first foreign trip was to see de Gaulle in a marked symbolic act of reconciliation with the French leader who had been so at odds with the United States, and particularly Lyndon Johnson during the 1960s. In fact, they were so concerned about the reception they would get in Europe that one of the reasons they held off the secret bombing of Cambodia was the perception that that would cause demonstrations in Europe if it were revealed. And Nixon hoped for huge crowds in Berlin and elsewhere to demonstrate how different the United States' position in the world would be seen as compared with the discredited Johnson administration. Of course, Nixon's hopes to have a presidency like Ike's to end the Korean War quickly did not come to fruition. He thought it could be ended through means of linkage in the Soviet Union, through threats, including that of nuclear weapons. But the world wasn't the same as 1953. The U.S. and the Soviet Union were at parity. America's relative power had declined. And I think we have to look at this period as a period of adjustment to a relative decline in power that the United States faced. Nixon and Kissinger came to terms with that. It also, I think, colors and should affect our perception on many of the policies they initiated, including some of the unilateralism of their policies, for example, on the economic realm in the ending of Bretton Woods. The book also spends a good deal of time, interestingly enough, on the Year of Europe. And I will defer a little bit on this later to Bill's comments on it, but Kissinger's own motives for the Year of Europe were very complex. And I've been spending some time, since he's usually identified with that so much, that in thinking about that, Kissinger himself discussed this in terms of creating or renewing an emotional connection between the American public and Europe after the early period of the first Nixon term had been spent so much in dealing with the Soviet Union, China, and the Vietnam War. He also thought about the value of European influence within American domestic politics, that ties to Europe served a real value in curbing political extremes in the United States, preventing a renewal of isolationism and political tendencies he deplored. Our volume gives several perspectives on the failure of the Year of Europe. Kissinger had his own explanation, namely Watergate and the demise of the American president during this time. Others would fault his own secretive approach, his own attempt to do things through back channels and other methods that would not work as well in alliance politics. But also the Middle Eastern War, one of the most direct cases of a clash of national interest between the United States and Europe, and one of the sharpest clashes between the United States and Europe during the era of the Cold War, came over the Middle East and came over the behavior of the United States and then its allies in either the resupply, preventing the resupply of Israel, the attempt of the Europeans to open a dialogue with the Arab world independent of the United States. This was a serious crisis and an intense and difficult time. And I think all of us, in looking back and reading in these articles, can see refrains that continue to this day. I want to mention something from the conclusion, because I think to the extent that the book offers, I think, a contribution to scholarly study of alliance politics, I think in many ways it offers us the opportunity to look at the history of alliances, and particularly the history of NATO, in terms of the cycles in alliance politics, recognizing that alliance politics frequently does move in cycles of cooperation and conflict, not always in any mechanical way, but in ways that are affected by election cycles, by economic trends and events, that have affected the way in which allies in the United States get along. We are in the midst probably of another aspect of that cycle now. What I hope to do in the conclusion in mentioning it was to argue that during the period, the first 40 years of U.S.-European post-war relations, there were three checks, you might say, on these cycles of alliance politics. One of them was the Cold War itself and the fear of the Soviet Union, which often also offered a constraint on how far the divisions and disagreements of the Allies would move. The Soviet Union often did something that forced cooperation back to an alliance, even when there were divisions over things like the Middle East or economic policy. The economic interdependence of the United States and Europe, which grew and developed, and which I still think is probably one of the leading aspects of understanding cycles in alliance politics today, providing a check on tendencies toward disagreement and toward disruption of the alliance. And finally, many of the institutions that were created that provided for alliance cooperation, NATO, other institutions that brought the allies together in forums on a ritual basis and compelled the discussion of differences. In the midst of all this, I do think there were always limits on the degree of harmony that any alliance could develop. Matthias will probably deal with this in more depth, but certainly the process of European integration, which in many ways is a big part of the story of this volume, created an immediate problem as the United States, particularly with Nixon and Kissinger, began to reevaluate whether it thought a united Europe was truly in America's interest, a contrast between what had been a very strong and powerful American policy from the 1940s through the 1960s. And secondly, I think American global concerns, particularly its involvements around the world, did create a difference in how it perceived and evaluated world questions and issues in a way that was different from Europe. Kissinger got into a lot of trouble, of course, for calling the Europeans or talking about the Europeans in terms of their regional role. But I think in some ways during this time it was still an accurate assessment of the differences in perception between the United States and Europe, even if it was in the process of changing. Were we to do this again, do this volume, for one, I know knowing how difficult these edited volumes are, there are a lot of things, though, I would love to have had more time and opportunity. I think in terms of limits, probably the one area that thankfully Matthias himself contributed to that's weaker in the volume is the second half of the 1970s. The first half of the 70s is covered quite thoroughly, and in part we had more documentation, more materials for that. The latter 70s is still an era in which more material is becoming available almost by the month and year to flesh out and develop, you might say, the final collapse of détente and the beginnings of the Second Cold War and the difficulties that entailed. I would have loved to have more about the fringes of Europe, namely the questions of Portugal and Spain and their democratic transitions, as well as the problems that did exist in the southern flank, the Greek and Turkish war over Cyprus. Finally, I would think, although this, of course, would have entailed almost another volume, would have been a more thorough attempt to look at Eastern Europe during this time and the beginnings of the changes occasioned by Helsinki, which is covered in Sarah Snyder's piece in the volume, but looking at some of the changes that began to develop during this time. All that said, I think the intriguing thing in retrospect about this volume is that although most of the literature on the North Atlantic Alliance and on relationship between the United States and Europe always stresses the difficulties and problems that have existed, the actual, I think, historically interesting fact that I think will in the end, 100 years from now, still be of great interest to historians is how they managed still to act together and retain a degree of unity that I think was unprecedented. And I think if anything, the strained alliance captures some of the difficulties of the 70s, but probably if we were going to go and think about this alliance in a longer historical perspective, I think thinking about what kept it together is probably equally as important as what drove it apart. Thank you.
Thank you. Matthias?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom. Thanks, Christian Ostermann, for inviting us here to the Wilson Center. Thank you for coming. Thank you also, David Lazar, for helping us edit this volume, Christoph Mauch and Hartmut Berghoff for supporting the volume. And I think I've thanked those
I know.
that I wanted to. Also to Werner, perhaps, as the author here. And I'm also very glad to welcome a student of mine who studied with me at Vanderbilt. I'm going to say a few things more about the European side of the European perceptions and involvement and the European experience of the 1970s. Obviously, I can't just give you a few glimpses of the topics treated and whet your appetite a little bit to read the book, which is destined both for researchers and for students of the Cold War, détente, and European Union studies as well, I'd say. So what's new? First, the book shifts our focus away from U.S.-Soviet détente, which has been studied in some detail already, but sees German Ostpolitik, European détente, as well as European integration as distinct ways by which the Western European allies sought to transform their continental international order in a peaceful manner. The book also contains, I would say, if you put all the articles together and sort of draw a synthesis from them, that U.S. relative decline, U.S. policies, and frequent strains resulting within the transatlantic partnership stimulated a number of those European initiatives in the 1970s, which prepared the European continent for what it has become. Finally, if it analyzes if, when, and how the dynamics of European integration, for example, British membership from 1973 onwards, and cooperation between France, Britain, and Germany especially, changed transatlantic partnership. Traditionally, we tend to think of Western integration as chiefly a product of U.S. informal empire over Western Europe. This at least has been the major argument put forward by Gary Lundestad in his book Empire by Integration. If anything, Western European states had been retreating since the Second World War and could not withstand the demands for decolonization. In the 1960s, Western European actors, especially France, began to become more self-assertive with respect to the United States, but essentially failed to modify the hegemonic structure of transatlantic relations in any thorough, constructive way. De Gaulle wanted a so-called European Europe, a Europe more independent from the superpowers, which could mediate and overcome the confrontational structure of the Cold War. But his European partners worried that what de Gaulle really meant was a Europe under French tutelage. So as David Bozow puts it, de Gaulle could say no to American proposals like the multilateral force or European federal dreams, but he could not alter constructively the structure within the alliance, nor the antagonistic nature of the blocs. According to the articles assembled in this book, this relative inability of Western Europe to shape its own destiny gave way to a new situation beginning in 1969. For the first time since the beginnings of European integration in the 1950s, Western European governments' international initiatives abounded. In turn, Western Europe began to play a much more active role in reshaping Europe and transforming East-West relations than in the decade before. Just how far it also was able to transform transatlantic relations remains open to debate. Tom has already talked about some of the structural changes pertaining to the United States' relative decline in power. The other major structural change was the growing affluence of Western Europe, including the countries of the European Community. In terms of GDP growth, GDP, steel production, exports, foreign aid, and some other indicators documented in the book, the future 9 members of the EC, Britain, Denmark, and Ireland, joined in 1973. The future 9 members of the EC had drawn equal with or left behind the United States at the beginning of the 1970s. But the economic weight of the EC did not translate into political influence, which caused some frustration among European leaders. Even government officials in the most pro-American countries in Western Europe complained about the lack of U.S. concern for their issues. President Nixon himself expressed clear doubts about the status of the United States as world leading power, and the specter of a European rival was very much on the minds of Nixon and Kissinger. But this did not keep Kissinger from comparing the European allies with the Greek city-states, ganging up against Alexander the Great. And this tells you a lot also about how Kissinger thought about himself. It was the West European security dilemma that prompted the first of a series of initiatives from the European allies. The new Ostpolitik, the German variant of détente, brought the Bonn government more into line with American détente policies initiated in the 1960s. At the same time, it also became a major stimulus for Nixon's call for an era of negotiations with the Soviets. Nixon did not pursue détente because it fitted so well with his political nature. Rather, he wanted détente to curtail the arms race, which became a major burden for the U.S. economy, and he hoped to gain popularity and win the 1972 presidential elections. As we learn, among others, from Bernd Schaefer's insightful contribution, he was loath of being outpaced by German Chancellor Willy Brandt, who was considered Man of the Year by Time magazine in 1970 and won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1971. Germany's motives for détente were more comprehensive than Nixon's. German Ostpolitik had essentially 2 objectives, we learn from the volume. As Gottfried Neidhardt points out, it tries to bring about a true reconciliation with the Eastern countries, which had tremendously suffered from the German War of Annihilation during World War II. Second, with the belief in U.S. deterrence as a provider of security waning in Europe, Ostpolitik tried to improve Western security by political rapprochement and compromises with the Soviet Union in order to transform Eastern threat perceptions and improve mutual understanding. Within this framework, Ostpolitik hoped to bring about contacts with the East German state in order to maintain and intensify economic, social, and family ties. Herein lay Ostpolitik's potential for transforming East-West relations. Instead of simply conserving the status quo, Barr's philosophy of change through rapprochement envisioned a European peace order in which German unification would not pose a threat to anybody and could be brought about by peaceful means and mutual consent. This required nothing less than overcoming the Cold War. But Bonn was not the only government interested in reshaping Europe and gaining more leverage. France, Britain, and many of the governments of the smaller European nations, which I would have liked to be treated more in detail in the book, but it was not so easy. More of these other governments were also eager to activate the potential inherent in European economic integration after de Gaulle had stepped down in 1969. Several articles of the volume put us right into the heart of the relaunching of European integration and both its transatlantic causes and consequences. There are still fundamental disputes about the nature and cause of European integration in the 1970s. Was this a stagnant decade, or was there a silent revolution underway, as Ferdinand Spohr contended in the early 1980s? The answers given in the book render a mitigated picture, but on the whole, it is more favorable than the contemporary terms stagflation and Eurosclerosis suggest. Claudia Hiepel seeks to find out why the European Community and the United States were not able to initiate a fruitful dialogue, although Nixon offered a so-called new transatlantic partnership when he came to office. She puts the blame on both sides. On the one hand, the European Community just emerged from a fragile state of the end of the 1960s and was extremely self-centered, for it had been unable for several years to resolve internecine conflicts about enlargement, agriculture policies, and cooperation on foreign policy. However, the Hague Summit in December 1969 proved to be a turning point. Not only did the community complete its common market for agricultural products and resolve its financing problems, it also agreed on an agenda to deepen integration, that is, to extend cooperation into new fields such as monetary policy, industrial research, transport, energy, and foreign policy. Finally, with CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, completed and deepening in sight, France agreed to resume negotiations for enlargement of the community, which led to the British entry in 1973, the stakes of which are discussed in detail by Ms. Heapel. The unexpected dynamics of European integration was not eyed with sympathy by Washington, and this was so for the first time since the Second World War. While Nixon claimed that he did not want to get involved in European internal debates, his attitude and policies signaled that he suspected the emergence of a rival power across the Atlantic. Agricultural policies, preferential trade agreements with 46 African, Caribbean, and Pacific third world countries, and the British entry into the European Community implied economic disadvantages for the United States and caused growing resentment among U.S. farmers and industrial lobbies. But the failure to renew transatlantic partnership was not due solely to completion and enlargement. We are reminded that U.S. producers benefited as much from U.S. protectionism as European products against European products as the other way around. In addition, Nixon failed to initiate high-level contacts with, quote, that jackass in Brussels. He referred to the president of the European Commission. You know his language, I guess. Because he considered the community as a pure trade bloc and trade issues were below his dignity as the world's leading statesman who only dealt with issues of pure power. Nixon's primary interest was a more equal burden sharing, but under Nixon that was an ambiguous demand because it meant that the United States would wield the power while the Allies would pay as much as possible of the bill. What this means is analyzed in detail by Hubert Zimmermann and William Gray, who looked from different angles at the causes and consequences of the dissolution of the Bretton Woods international monetary system, in which the Allies managed financial relations, balance of payments crises, and fixed exchange rates. Now, I don't want to go into the details here, but let me just emphasize that the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and of dollar convertibility caused major turbulences among the European currencies, and despite efforts on the part of the West German government to sort of help the United States stabilize the dollar for about 2.5 years, until 1973, this was not reciprocated, or they were not being thanked in any way. The United States essentially opted for national autonomy in monetary matters and thereby abandoned the transatlantic partnership, because it was essentially the transatlantic partners which made the IMF work in those days. So the consequences were that the Europeans embarked on the creation of a European monetary order, first by establishing the exchange rate mechanism, which later on in the 70s was transformed into a European monetary system. And the volume tells us a little bit more about what the exact problems were, how the discussions went, how the negotiations went, what kind of pressure was exerted on the different actors, and why finally these solutions, this European solution, came about. So this meant that transatlantic partnership was abandoned in one important aspect by the United States, and the Europeans therefore had basically no choice but, in order to save the common market, to opt for Europe, to opt for a European solution. The third chapter of the book, I think, is one of the most important chapters, deals with Washington's attempts to restore its damaged leadership position by a new Atlantic Charter comprising security, economic, and monetary rules of conduct, and the reaction to it by the Europe of the Nine, which was coordinated then essentially by the French and British governments. By calling his initiative, launched in 1973, Year of Europe, without asking the Europeans, Kissinger's initiative was perceived from the beginning by the West European allies as an imperious attempt to reconsolidate and even extend Europe's supremacy over the allies by linking the security guarantee to economic concessions and some kind of political subordination. In addition, the Europeans felt humiliated by Kissinger's presumptuously ascribing a global role to the United States and solely regional responsibilities to Europe. European resistance to the initiative hardened when Kissinger resorted to blackmail, like threatening with American withdrawal from Europe if he didn't get what he wanted. As the articles by Daniel Muckley, Fabian Hilfrich, and Alistair Noble show, the Europeans were loath of the U.S. government abandoning responsible leadership on one point, only to reclaim it selectively to further its own interests. Initially, the initiative spurred the will of the Europeans to intensify foreign policy coordination and formulate their own policy preferences according to European choices before consulting with the Americans. The Nine's famous Declaration on European Identity symbolized their desire to secure and even enlarge their autonomy from the United States. Yet Kissinger successfully used both the old crisis triggered by American weapons deliveries to Israel, which hit Western Europe a lot harder than the United States, and blackmail against especially the Bonn government to isolate France and obtain both European participation in the Washington Energy Conference and a compromise on transatlantic rules of consultation. In addition, changes at the helm of the French, British, and West German governments in the winter and spring of 1974 brought a team of leaders to power who were all committed to the continued success of transatlantic partnership. Basically, the Europeans had no choice during the oil crisis but to opt for cooperation with the Americans. Yet if Kissinger sought to really extend U.S. hegemony and submit the European community under NATO, as the Europeans feared and some of the sources indicate, he did not attain this objective neither. In fact, shortly after coming to power, President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and Federal Chancellor Helmut Schmidt decided, together with the other EC governments, to strengthen the EC by institutionalizing the European Council and intensifying European political cooperation, that is, foreign policy coordination. They also commissioned a reflection paper on the so-called finalité of European Union, which, although not immediately implemented, served as a guiding star for future discussions on the deepening of integration. In the following years, the EC played a genuine leadership role in the Helsinki negotiations through European political cooperation. It set an example for a more balanced relationship with the Third World by way of the Lomé Convention of 1975, and it initiated a Europe-Arab dialogue which annoyed Kissinger. The row over the Year of Europe lasted only a short time, but it was not forgotten. It was essentially the change in the U.S. presidency that made way for improved and more genuine transatlantic relations. Having established good personal contact with Schmidt and Giscard claimed their share in economic and financial global leadership by proposing summits of the heads of the leading economies, the famous G6 and then G7. Encouraged by Washington's temporary readiness to resume some degree of monetary cooperation, they succeeded in binding the United States in. Leading to constructive results with Ford and a short period of stability, however, the new summits became an occasion for a clash of characters between Schmidt and U.S. President Carter from 1977 onwards, which formed the last part of the book. Schmidt and Carter neither shared the same economic nor political philosophies, and Carter provoked a major conflict when he lectured the Chancellor at the London G7 summit over the dangers of nuclear proliferation. On substance, actually, he was right, since Germany had agreed to transfer nuclear plant and enrichment technology to the Brazilian dictatorship in 1975 in a way that did not conform sufficiently to its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Fiscal stimulus packages, the neutron bomb, as well as U.S. energy policy, which contributed to the second oil crisis beginning in 1979, formed other bones of contention. While the president's erratic decision-making concerning the neutron bomb destroyed Schmidt's confidence in Carter's reliability, the second dollar crisis led to one of the most important transatlantic rifts until the European Union split over the war against Iraq in 2003. In 1977-78, U.S. oil imports continued to aggravate the trade deficit, and Carter's fiscal and monetary policies designed to fuel domestic growth and improve the competitiveness of the U.S. economy led to a massive devaluation of the dollar. It all resembled very much Nixon's early attempt to externalize adjustment costs. The consequence for the European common market included a new series of turbulences, the destabilization of the common market for industrial goods, and the virtual destruction of common prices for agricultural products. The second dollar crisis led Europe decision makers into believing that Europe could no longer wait for a responsible U.S. monetary policy. The articles co-authored by Joe Renoir and Nathan Vigil, as well as mine, analyze in depth the motives for the EMS and how it set Europe further apart from the United States. Carter's relationship with the Allies ended just about as the decade began, namely with a widening Atlantic. And also, the issues were very similar to the ones that shaped the beginning of the decade: détente and the arms race. Only here, the survival of détente was at stake. Carter's great success to keep the alliance united by NATO's dual-track decision was compromised from the very beginning by the Europeans' insistence that the decision to deploy intermediate-range nuclear missiles to counter Soviet SS-20 was accompanied by an offer to the Soviets to negotiate. In fact, while Carter took a distance from détente already before the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, the Europeans wanted to retain détente even afterwards. So NATO remained united on surface, but the political expectations and strategies diverged, and the growing peace movement in Western Europe signaled that the Atlantic was widening again. Carter's call for economic sanctions against the Soviet Union after Afghanistan went unheeded by the Western Allies. His call for an Olympic boycott was only followed by the Bonn government, who didn't want another row over a minor issue. Even Carter's human rights policy was regarded as compromising détente, as it resulted in renewed repression rather than improving the situation in Europe. In sum, at the end of the decade, the United States and its European allies were fundamentally at odds over the continuation of détente, but agreed on the necessity to maintain a military balance of power with the Soviets. Faced with U.S. weakness and arrogance, that refers to Nixon only, and Kissinger in some degree, Europe had to find its own role in the world without a past that could serve for orientation. Did the EC do everything to fill the gaps left by the United States? Certainly not. It did not develop that kind of hard power which the United States possessed, but it did not help to win the war against North Vietnam. But developing more hard power would hardly have brought about the change in threat perceptions which occurred in the Soviet Union during the 1980s. On the other hand, the articles assembled in this book suggest that the EC developed a lot of soft power skills and strategies during the 1970s and consciously established new institutional venues to intensify negotiations with the United States, the Soviets, and the Third World. Those new instruments underline Europe's embrace of multilateralism and its skillful, though not always successful, mastery of multilateral diplomacy, its acceptance of increased responsibilities for world peace, and Europe's emergence as a civilian power. In other words, the decade led to some kind of definition of European identity, which was not yet very much clear at the beginning of the decade. To conclude, European integration in this period evolved less as a result of U.S. support, as it did in the 1950s and still also in the 1960s, but rather as a result of U.S. relative decline, some U.S. policy failures, and a growing awareness among Western European governments that U.S. foreign policies did frequently not heed their concerns, but were too often based upon exclusive U.S. domestic interests or issues, including electoral ones. However, none of the articles in this book contends that any major initiative taken by European leaders was directed against the United States. Rather, those initiatives resulted from the realization by the Europeans that they could, indeed had, to do more to shape their own destinies. In parallel, except for the Year of Europe crisis maybe, the United States did not willfully impede or disavow progress toward European integration. Therefore, the alliance was strained, but the fundamental loyalty and the belief in its necessity and desirability was upheld by both the partners in Washington and in Western Europe. The Atlantic was widening, but while some bridges collapsed, new bridges were built to make it continue to work, so that the alliance was ready to help bring about the peaceful transformation of Europe when Mikhail Gorbachev and the people in Eastern Europe made it possible to happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for this in-depth highlighting of some of the findings. And now we have the privilege to hear some comments from Ambassador Jonathan Dean. Let me just say a few words by introduction. He joined the U.S. Foreign Service in 1949 and was involved in German affairs. In the middle 50s, he helped to establish the new federal German armed forces and helped with German entry into NATO. He was a lead negotiator, U.S. negotiator for the 1971 quadripartite agreement on Berlin. Then, from 73 to 81, was the deputy U.S. representative, and then the U.S. representative to the NATO Warsaw Pact force reduction negotiations in Vienna, the MBFR talks. In 1982, he joined the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace as resident associate for arms control and international security issues. Later on, from 84 until 2006, served as advisor on arms control and international security issues to the Union of Concerned Scientists. He's the author of several books on European security and has a PhD degree in political science from George Washington University. It's with great pleasure to give you the floor, Ambassador Dean.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm grateful for this opportunity to hear the presentations and to read this book, which I regard as a very useful handbook for the development of the European Union. A few weeks ago, on November 19th, the Belgian Prime Minister, Herman Van Rompuy, assumed office as the first president of the European Union, with Catherine Ashton at his side as High Representative for Foreign Affairs. Many of you saw the article in the Washington Post, which devoted on the 22nd of November a fairly perfunctory editorial to this event, pointing out that in future Europe's global influence will be determined by its economic weight and willingness to remain a military partner of the United States. This was a low-key commemoration of a highly important event. Future historians will probably characterize the emergence of the European Union as the most important single political event of the 21st century, as the emergence of the United States was the most important political event of the 18th century, and the emergence of the United Nations, the most important positive development of the 20th century. Each of these developments brought into the international system new entities which were and are destined to have decisive, positive political effects on that system. That's why I think the book we have before us, A Strained Alliance, is a valuable one. It describes the events of the key decade in the development of the European Union, a decade which brought decisive steps in coordination of political and economic policies of the new entity. In spite of many reverses, the European political elite, shaken to the core by the most powerful and the most painful experiences in the human history, 2 world wars and the Cold War threat of extinction of the human race, maintained its program for fundamental changes which would make repetition of that experience impossible. They faced stiff opposition from status quo forces and alternating support and opposition from the United States, the most powerful government of the time. Fortunately for the outcome, the United States was, and we have heard something of that already today, was at no time certain whether it faced the emergence of a new and competitive European superpower or just the continuation of bickering among the European tribes. The ongoing Cold War and the need to support European freedom of decision against the Soviets also prevented closer American analysis of the long-term implications of European integration. During the decade of the 70s, the worries and the mutual suspicions of an alliance depended for its survival on extended deterrence, the military power and fallible judgment of a single member of the alliance repeatedly came to a head, but considerable progress, as we have heard, was nevertheless made in providing formal structure and procedures for coordination of foreign and economic policy. And the alliance survived to carry its members into the final period of the Cold War and into a period of new human-generated worldwide challenges to the survival of humanity. The first 4 chapters of the book, as we've heard, cover German Ostpolitik and the American reaction to it. Suspicions on American and European sides are well described, but what perhaps does not emerge with full clarity from the narrative in the book is the fact that both the Soviet Union and the Western Allies had so much invested in the status quo that they did not dare to seriously risk its continuation. For example, President Nixon doubtless considered his threats to withdraw some American forces from Europe as a means of constraining federal German Ostpolitik and to be an ultimate menace to the Allies. But he did not have much elbow room for action in carrying out this threat. American leaders and officials had expected that federal Germany would rapidly act to develop relations with East Germany and the Soviet Union over Ostpolitik, but they were startled by the actual rapidity and extent of German policy. Egon Bahr's first report to the Allies of negotiations with the Soviet Union showed that the complicated task of negotiation was almost finished, and President Nixon's threats to withdraw U.S. forces from Europe did not have great effect. Americans and Europeans both observed that the Nixon administration itself vigorously opposed efforts of a vocal Democratic minority in Congress to withdraw U.S. forces from Europe. The worries of American observers that the Soviet Union would find some way to exploit the German public's interest in reunification of Germany did not materialize. well-founded Soviet fears that they would lose control of developments prevented far-reaching offers for free elections. It's difficult to realize this today, but possible Soviet offers of this kind were the major Cold War worry of Western officials, who almost universally overrated Soviet capacity to manipulate the unification theme and overestimated West German desire for progress on unification at any cost. Nixon and Kissinger's suspicion of Brandt and of Ostpolitik was held in restraint by their realization of the damage that would occur if the federal German public became convinced that the U.S. was blocking progress towards German unification. The second major section of this book contains chapters on collapse of the transatlantic monetary order and further decline of U.S. influence in Europe. Events made clear that the United States was fixated on its own trade interests and rather blind to European interests, which gradually played a dominant role. Chapter 7 describes a battle over Professor Schiller's efforts to reform the European monetary system. It contains a brief reference to Jean Monnet's efforts to press for European monetary union, a reference which reminded me of the existence of repeated quiet meetings between Monnet and senior American officials like Robert Schetzel and Russell Fessenden and German leaders like Kurt Birnbach. This quiet activity did not play any role in official U.S. dealings and is not covered in the book we are discussing now, although it was quite important for the outcome. Part 3 of the book covers Kissinger's year of Europe and the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. This chapter contains a comment by Sarah Snyder that U.S. officials assigned to the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe received no instructions from Washington on the line that they should take in the conference. It seems evident that Kissinger, caught up in the Watergate affair, was focusing on negotiating with the Soviets on nuclear issues, and that he almost completely missed the significance of the Helsinki process in weakening the Soviet hold over Eastern Europe. It's interesting that U.S. negotiators in the mutual and balanced force reduction talks in the same period also received no instructions from Washington. These MBFR negotiations culminated in an agreement which documented that the hold of the Soviet military on Soviet policy in Europe had been broken. The fourth and the final section of this book traces how Helmut Schmidt developed a leading position in the German government, and also how he became an important leader of the move for European integration. These chapters document what is probably, until the advent of George W. Bush, the period of greatest friction in U.S.-European and U.S.-German relations. Jimmy Carter, the most unschooled of modern American presidents in foreign affairs, played a central role. The section, as we have heard, covers the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and Carter's related unilateral decision to boycott the Olympic Games. It also includes the neutron bomb fiasco, where Carter convinced a reluctant Schmidt that deployment of the bomb was essential, and then unilaterally withdrew the U.S. from that decision. And it includes the dual-track decision to deploy a new generation of medium-range missiles and to negotiate at the same time on their reduction. A transaction which left the main governments involved, the U.S., the German, and the Soviet, thoroughly discredited in the eyes of the European and American publics. This pained reaction pointed to the fact that these publics had had enough of the Cold War, and this book is an admirable guide to its final phase. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dean. I'm particularly grateful to Ambassador Dean since he agreed to this at very, very short notice. So thank you again. The floor is open for questions and comments. In Wilson Center tradition, I'd like to ask you to wait for the microphone, in part because this event is being webcast live, and so without the microphone, you won't be heard. And secondly, if you could please state your name and affiliation. Yes, over here.
My name is Stephen Shore. No one mentioned the Prague Spring. Did that have any long-term consequences for East-West relations?
Interestingly enough, no. The fascinating thing about the Prague Spring is how quickly both the United States and the Soviet Union were willing to put it behind them. In an excellent collection of documents from the back channel that the State Department put together with the Russian Foreign Ministry, documenting Kissinger and Dobrynin's discussions. What's fascinating is how quickly Kissinger tells Dobrynin, look, we're not going to mess around with any sorts of Eastern Europe. We understand your position there. And the idea, the only thing that the suppression of the Prague Spring really did was prevent Johnson from trying to initiate the SALT talks at the end of his presidency, which he wanted to. But in fact, I actually would argue there's relatively little consequence from that. It perhaps is a sign of a very different understanding at that time of the situation or the division of Europe.
Yeah, both sides were, I mean, it's not really, it doesn't really fall into the period we are treated here because we started in 69. But both sides, Soviet Union and the U.S. government, were sort of eager to avoid a repetition of such a scenario because they both wanted to go ahead with détente.
Thank you. The gentleman, yeah, Howard, yeah.
Thanks very much. I'm Howard Wiarda from the Wilson Center. I have a dozen questions, but I'd just like to ask Professor Schwartz to give us a little preview of his Kissinger book, if you wouldn't mind. After Bob Dalek's book and a dozen others that are really quite good, is there a new cache of documents that you've discovered, or tell us what your position will be? Just if you can give us a hint or two.
Okay.
I think we're intrigued.
Okay. Well, I'll start off with a story I like to tell because it sort of gives me a chance to imitate Henry Kissinger. I after repeated efforts and probably the intercession of some people here at the Wilson Center and others, I finally got an interview with Kissinger. And I told him that my goal was to write a short, concise biography of him. And he looked at me and said, but you will leave things out. And I will leave things out. I'm actually trying to write a book focused on what I think are the main ways in which his life provides a prism into the history of American power in the 20th century. And in a way, his life, even before he becomes National Security Advisor, is an interesting prism into the you might say one of the seminal events of the century, the Second World War, of course, as a German refugee, and the way in which the war, of course, changed the United States. And the war itself was, of course, the reason Kissinger became anything more than an accountant. He was going to the City University of New York, planning very much a career helping the family business or whatever, and yet the war gave him the opportunity to be an official in charge of sections of Germany as an occupation official, and to round up Gestapo, an experience of power and authority that he never lost, you might say, or never lost the feeling of. His role at Harvard in the 1950s as an advisor to Rockefeller, his role in the discussion, the public debate about nuclear weapons and alliance politics in this period was also a reflection, I think, of American foreign policy during this time, and I think is a useful prism, again, into seeing these debates. Finally, I suppose the central theme that I'd like to bring to discussion, and there's an enormous amount of material. Kissinger is probably, and Tom Blanton of the National Security Archive says this, so I always feel like I have good authority for it. But he says he's probably the most documented single American public figure in terms of the paper recording his telephone calls, the memorandum of conversation, the reports, so that one has to get away, you might say, from the sheer mass of documents to sort of think about what the central aspects that the Kissinger role conveys. And in my view, it really conveys something about the connection between the exercise of American power and American domestic politics, in part because Kissinger's very failure, and the failure ultimately of realism to become of the type of realism that Kissinger sought to encourage and educate Americans in, the failure of that, I think, reflects on an inability to understand fully the domestic institutions that are the basis of American foreign policy and provide legitimacy to that policy. So to the, I'm sure Bob Dallek, Jeremy Surrey, I go, Jussi Hanamäki, I go into a company of enormously gifted historians. I would say that if I can write a book that conveys something about Kissinger to my students who don't know who he is, don't have any idea of what he represents. In fact, I love putting up the PowerPoint slide of Henry at the time of his appointment, Henry Kissinger at the time of his appointment, and then a slide of a group of Playboy bunnies around a picture of Henry Kissinger saying this man was actually a sex symbol for a period of time. None of them believe that, of course, when they see the picture. Even conveying something of what Kissinger was about, the period of time in which he lived. And I have one, you asked about whether I have any special sources. And the one special source that I've been able to tap, and I want to somehow integrate into the book, but which there's some problems of doing it, but I'm going to still try, is I have all of the television news coverage of Henry Kissinger from 1968 through 1976, and even after that. And what I want to do is provide links to the most important stories where Kissinger's role becomes clear, even in the early period when he's appointed, and when Nixon says quite eloquently, well, I've told Henry Kissinger I don't want him to replace the Secretary of State. I'm going to have a strong Secretary of State. Being able to use some of that for the irony, of course, of those comments, to his first interviews at the time. He was not usually used as a public spokesman for the administration. But to use the television coverage to convey something of what he represented and was during that time. So I'll put it. It'll be short enough to read. That's the one problem with Kissinger. Most Kissinger books is they're pretty long. So I do hope that it might be the sort of book that actually is read.
Great, thank you. I think we all look forward to that. Yes.
I have to write it first.
Wolfensberger.
Yes, I'm Don Wolfensberger with the Congress Project here at the Wilson Center. Welcome back, Tom. Good to see you. Enjoyed all of your presentations. Reference was made to Willy Brandt's initiative on Ostpolitik and the fact that the U.S. had some unease with that. I was wondering to what extent that is reflected in some of the documentation you have as to how we were to deal with that, and whether the later disclosure that his top aide was a spy for East Germany played into that at all or confirmed any of our unease.
That is, I would say, perfectly documented, because you have essentially two discourses about Ostpolitik within the American administration. The State Department was generally favorable, and that continuously, both in private conversations as well as publicly. And Nixon and Kissinger had severe doubts about it when Brandt and Barr sort of explained what they wanted to do, and in the process of, when negotiations started. And so there was a double discourse. Secretly, there were always kind of skeptical remarks, also because Nixon didn't like Brandt, as I mentioned. But publicly, there was a kind of non-discourse, you might say. Nixon said he promised basically to the opposition leader, the German opposition leader, Barzel, that he would not get involved. But at some point he had to. And this is described in detail in the book, or analyzed in detail in the book, because somehow Brandt and Barr managed to create a kind of parallelism between the SALT talks, the Berlin talks, and the Eastern treaties, because they were sort of conditioned, or the support for the Eastern treaties from German side depended on the conclusion of the Berlin Agreement, and the Soviets said, well, we're going to only engage in SALT and conclude a SALT agreement when those German treaties, those Eastern German treaties, will be ratified by Germany. So there were linkages, but those linkages were just not made or organized by Kissinger. They were organized by the others, by West German government and by the Soviet government. So at some point in 1970, 71, Nixon and Kissinger had to go with it and basically support de facto Ostpolitik.
Can I briefly just add, one of the people I've learned the most, a great deal about on this is Werner Lippert, who was my grad student who worked on the Nixon-Kissinger relationship with Brandt and Barr. I'm wondering if, Werner, you want to just add anything on this from your own sense? Do we have a mic somewhere?
Well, give him a moment to think about it.
Okay.
And let's bring Ambassador Dean in on the conversation, and then Werner gives you a minute to think about it.
Yeah. Well, of course, among our first instructions that we received when the Ostpolitik started, and was the great distaste that Nixon and Kissinger had for this process, and but the other notable aspect of it is that they didn't do anything about it, and never tried to take any kind of official action to block it. I think because of a point I made earlier, they did not want to have it said of them that the United States was trying to block progress towards German unity. That was too important a future project.
Thank you. Werner?
I would also add that, as Ambassador Dean said, I'm not sure that they had an alternative. What were they to say? Well, no, we're not going to support German unification. We're not going to support German rapprochement with the Soviet Union, even though we want to push it. So there was sort of would have been an intellectual dishonesty there. On the other hand, I don't think, especially initially, if we talk about 70, 71, they really appreciated how far Brandt would be able to take it. So at the time when they potentially could have done something about it, they didn't really perceive the need to, maybe.
Thank you. Any other questions? We'll go right to on the left side, and then the hand there.
My name is Edmund Radka, University of Munich, and currently with SAIS at Johns Hopkins. I wanted to highlight a feature of the 70s that you didn't mention, and because integration in this time was driven mostly by member states. So we saw not this kind of supranational integration with Commission, but all these new movements like the European Council, the EMS, were organized by the member states. So if you now judge the 70s as a successful period of integration, probably we could learn for the future that European integration can be successful if the member states drive the process. And then I want to refer to Ambassador Dean's comment about the Lisbon Treaty and about Van Rompuy and Catherine Ashton, because this was a decision that was judged very, very critical in Europe and by European public. But would this be another peril that we have, that now a new time begins when the member states play a decisive role and not important figures on the European level, as the member states opted for these rather low-key figures as the EU top leaders?
Thank you. It's more of a comment, I guess, but Matthias, would you like?
I can take it up. I think it depends really on the constellation, whether intergovernmentalism can push forward a project or not. And the commitment was positive by Schmidt and Giscard, but also came to a certain point where they didn't know exactly where to go. Intergovernmentalism was the smallest common denominator, you might say. So they strengthened the summitry, the practice of summits through the European Council, institutionalized them. The bargain here was that states who had demanded sort of democratization of the European integration process already since the beginning of the 60s, like Italy, Benelux, and West Germany, they pushed for direct elections on the European Parliament and obtained this in 1979. So this was part of this bargain. We strengthened intergovernmentalism, but at the same time, the European Parliament, as one of the supranational organs, would also be strengthened. And then they left it basically to the future to see whether that Parliament would acquire legitimacy and then be able to extend its rights, which it did very quickly, actually, with the Single European Act and then Maastricht Treaty, Amsterdam Treaty, and so on. So it extended power. Today, you could say it's a full-fledged Parliament, basically.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. We have a couple more. So we'll go first over here. And was there another question over there? No. Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, Garrett Martin of the European Institute. I have two questions. I mean, the first one is about the conception of the transatlantic relations, and a point I think Professor Schwartz alluded to is there are no shortages of crises, of conflicts, of difficult moments in the 6 decades, and most of the books include the word crisis in one shape or another. And I'm wondering if it's not misleading, because ultimately it gives a sense of an alliance permanently on the verge of collapse. And if you look at the 70s, one could easily argue that the institutionalization of the G7 is probably one of the most important aspects, and it doesn't get anywhere the same amount of coverage. And the second is a bit more of a speculative question, but what are the chances that the current American president, if re-elected, decides to have a new year of Europe to re-inject some emotion in a rather lackluster transatlantic relations?
Oh, well, I count on Garrett to ask me this. This is, you're coming down your point about, this is an alliance permanently in crisis. I mean, Kissinger himself, there's a great story about Kissinger writing his book on the alliance called The Troubled Partnership. It was a book that didn't sell well, except in one small town in the Midwest where they put it in the marriage section, and that was that actually it sold well there. But I do think this is why I guess I've been a specialist in transatlantic books and things, and the idea is you're always looking for crises. And so one of the things that we did include in the conclusion was a line that I think is important, that there's never a golden age in the alliance. There's never one period where the alliance was in great shape, everybody was happy and everything. There's always been crises and problems within the alliance. Question is, of course, also trying to come to some sort of balance and recognize those things that have managed to overcome it. And that's why I go to some sort of a notion of cyclical, looking at the alliances in part in a cyclical manner, and recognizing that they are dependent in part on political cycles, economic cycles, in terms of what crises come up, how severe they are. Whether there's in that sense, some of the patterns tend to repeat themselves too, and the ways in which the countries talk about each other, the anger about consultation, which is the perennial European complaint, the Americans complaining about the lack of European contribution. These are sorts of things that have gone on all the way through. But I do think I think the Cold War, there were some constraints to them that did disappear after 1989, and that do force a reevaluation of what it is exactly that binds us now. But I would argue, actually, even after the Iraq crisis, I think eventually historians are going to basically argue that after the initial crisis, there were immediately efforts to tame it down, in part from economic, other political concerns that came to the fore. I was glad I actually got the chance last night to watch the Obama speech, and was taken with the idea that he talked about the Allies and NATO, and he talked about their contribution. And listening to Matthias talk about how Afghanistan once divided the Allies, it's very interesting because this could be symbolically a way that Obama will demonstrate the difference from the past administration by showing that he has multilateral support. And I would imagine that that will become an especially important point for him in dealing with his own difficult base in the United States, who are very opposed to this decision, but he can say, look, this is something with international legitimacy. He can point to that and argue. So I'm not sure whether he'd need a year of Europe, but it will be interesting to see whether he also decides and comes back to the idea, especially if he actually gets something of a success out of Afghanistan, or at least a relatively more stable state, whether he decides in his second term to become more of a foreign policy president and actually devote more attention or time to Europe.
Yes, any?
Yeah, I think, well, Tom said a lot already, but conflicts were more frequent in the 1970s than in the 1960s. There had already been severe conflicts during the 1960s, especially about the MLF and the question of German nuclear sharing. That was a major issue where Soviets and the French and the British, in a sense, intervened with the U.S. government to sort of prevent this from being realized, this project of the multilateral force. But, well, I mean, monetary issues are maybe not that attractive, let's say. They don't attract that much attention in the larger historical community. But they were severe, of course. And then there was also this frequency in the 1970s that you basically had every year or every other year you had a major crisis across the Atlantic. So I would say that things were getting more rough in general. And that was probably partly because of Ostpolitik and Détente and the fact also that the confidence in the U.S. security guarantee was no more that strong. And Détente made it easier also for both parties, United States and Western European partners, to sort of try to go their own ways. No.
Thank you. Ambassador Dean, the final word.
Well, thank you. Like the alliance, the European integration process was in permanent crisis. And what I think is striking is that although the United States did not have many answers, those pushing for European integration had an immediate answer to every crisis and pushed for some new device or some new instrument that would express European integration. They had the final push with the Lisbon Treaty after it was obvious that the European public opinion was no longer even faintly interested in the subject. That left them pushing against not much resistance, but also against an enormous impediment of disinterest. And the question is, since that European elite has died out or is dying out, who now will push further, and will there be further impetus to this process, which to me, as I pointed out at the outset, is the most interesting political development of this time.
Thank you. On that note, let me again say the book is The Strained Alliance. It's a German Historical Institute publication. I think David would be happy to get any expressions of interest in volumes. David, raise your hand so that everybody can see you. Now, on behalf of the German Historical Institute and Wilson Center, I'd like to invite you to a glass of wine and some nibbles outside, but not before thanking our panelists for a stimulating, thoughtful, good discussion and presentation here. Thank you for sharing your insights and comments. Hope to see you again at the Wilson Center soon. We're adjourned, and the reception is right outside. Thank you.
Thank you.